In 1965, one of the most famous alien encounters of the decade would happen in Valensole, France. Not only was a significant amount of evidence found at the scene, but also the witness was considered to be highly credible. The case also features characteristics we see time and time again in alien encounters, such as the description of the craft and the beings. In this episode, we will examine the 1965 alien encounter of Maurice Masse. Around 5 a.m. on July 1st, 1965, French farmer Maurice Masse woke up and got dressed in preparation for his workday. Maurice was a lavender farmer in the small village of Valensole, France, located just outside Nice. That morning, Maurice was on somewhat of an alert as someone had been stealing lavender from his fields. Maurice and his father had reported the matter to the police, but no one had been caught. Around 5:45 a.m., Maurice headed out to the fields and decided to have a quick cigarette before work. Then Maurice would hear a strange sound in the sky that sounded like whistling. He thought it could be a helicopter, and as he glanced around, he would see a strange object sitting in one of the fields. He was around 200 feet away at the time, and believing it to be the people who were taking his lavender, he began walking over to get a better view. As he was walking toward the UFO, he would spot two small humanoids. He believed it was children, but as he got closer, he would realize whatever it was wasn't human. Maurice would make out more and more details on both the craft and the strange beings. The craft was oval-shaped, reminding Maurice of a rugby football. It had a cupola on top, not centered with the top of the object, but stretching further to the rear of the end, or to Maurice's right. The UFO stood on 6 thin silver legs in a circular arrangement, originating from the middle of the craft's underside, and they bowed outwards a little over a meter or so. In the center of the legs, there was a central pivot which stuck into the ground beneath the object. Maurice could see inside an open doorway and saw what appeared to be 2 seats inside. The beings were a little less than 4 feet tall and had on tight-fitting, gray-greenish suits, but no head covering. Their skin was grayish-white, and their heads were pumpkin-like, disproportionate to their bodies. The eyes were large, black, and slanted around the face. Interestingly, Maurice would state that the eyes seemed to convey human emotion. The mouth appeared to be a slit, and their noses were just 2 dots. The beings had a sharp chin, and interestingly, the ETs were reported to make sounds like they were grumbling. The grumbling sounds seemed to come from their throats, but Maurice believed it was some kind of communication, although he did not actually see their mouths move. The being suits each possessed a belt, one which contained a small container on the left and a larger one on the right. As Maurice got about 15 feet away, suddenly one of the beings would point a pencil-like device that paralyzed him. Strangely, Maurice was still standing up as he was paralyzed. He could still feel his heartbeat and blink, but couldn't move any major muscles. The pencil-like device is something we have seen in prior episodes on this channel, and we will discuss it later in the video. As Maurice was paralyzed, the beings were collecting and seemingly analyzing the lavender plants. Maurice would later describe their movements as rising and falling in space, like bubbles in a bottle, without apparent support. Or he would describe them as sliding along bands of light. They were reported by Maurice to be outside for around a minute once he was paralyzed. The beings would then head back into the craft. The door closed, and Maurice would describe it like the front part of a wooden file cabinet. Maurice stated he could see them looking at him from inside the cockpit while the legs swirled and eventually retracted. A thump then came from the central pivot, and the machine lifted off, floating silently away. At around 20 meters from the landing site, the object simply vanished from view. In Maurice's words, one moment the thing was there, and the next moment it was not there anymore. At this time, Maurice was still paralyzed and couldn't move. It would soon begin to wear off though, and after around 20 minutes, the paralysis ended. One ufologist who examined the case, Amy Michelle, suggested that the paralysis was a form of hypnotic suggestion in nature, as if it had been muscular paralysis. Maurice would have died within 20 minutes he spent in that state. There's multiple cases we've covered where entities seem to be able to hypnotize abductees and experiencers. Usually, though, people are not standing up during this time. After the paralysis ended, Maurice would head back into town and go to a local restaurant. He told the owner his story, who called the cops. They and Maurice would head out to the site, and there were imprints that were found in the soil where the craft had been. The traces present when Maurice and company returned from town consisted of a flat imprint just over a meter in diameter. In the center of it, where the central pivot had been, was a cylindrical hole around 30 centimeters deep and 15 centimeters in diameter. From the hole radiated 4 flat grooves, making an X shape. Each groove was 2 meters long and 25 centimeters deep. Strangely, the soil at the spot was of near liquid consistency, despite the fact that it had not rained for some time. When Maurice returned to the spot later that evening, the soil surrounding the central trace had turned to the consistency of cement. Seemingly, the craft had changed the composition of the soil, with it becoming hard as rock. In time, the area would develop a circular patch where lavender refused to grow, although a few weeds remained. Maurice even replowed the area, but the lavender refused to grow there. Lavender plants around the perimeter were stunted and withered looking. More evidence that something bizarre had happened. The calcium content of the soil at the site was found to be much higher than that of surrounding soil. It's said that traces of the UFO were found on lavender plants stretching for around 400 meters from the site, heading in the direction of the town of Monisca. In the weeks that followed, Maurice would experience strange physical effects too. He was constantly exhausted and couldn't stay awake for more than 4 hours. It's not known if Maurice was taken aboard the craft during the time he was paralyzed. Despite being paralyzed by the humanoid beings and some later health problems, Maurice said he had a positive feeling about his encounter. It's important to note Maurice was well known and highly respected in his community. In addition, all the local authorities who examined his case reached the conclusion that he was telling the truth. That said, what can we make of Maurice's case? The case was investigated by UFO researcher Amy Michelle. Michelle would present documents and data to him in regards to a landing that happened a year prior in the country of Italy. Maurice showed this photo when he believed there was no more information he could extract from Maurice. After Maurice saw the photo, Michelle would write, "The effect produced on him was fantastic. I had the impression that, on seeing the image, Maurice was at his last gasp, as though he had just looked upon his own death. At first he thought somebody had photographed his machine. When he learnt that this one had been seen in the United States by a policeman, he seemed relieved and said to me, 'You see then that I wasn't dreaming and that I am not mad.'" Simply stated, the Maurice Masse case appears to be a legitimate one, with many characteristics we see in other cases. The first similarity is the reports of the beings. They wore tight-fitted green suits and appeared as gray aliens. Often grays are said to be wearing silver suits, but a good number of cases report green suits as well. The craft was egg-shaped or rugby-shaped. The size and description of it is something we see time and time again in other cases. There's various theories on what these smaller ships are, but most think they are exploratory crafts that dock with a larger mothership that probably handle the long-distance space travel. Another theory is the ships might actually have the capability for intergalactic travel. Still, some have reported seeing these massive motherships in the sky as well. Amazingly, some have reported the crafts to be miles long. Critics often state these sightings are an optical illusion, but in some cases these massive crafts are seen from different vantage points. One of the more interesting things and unique details of this case concerns the pencil-like object the beings used to paralyze him. Another case, the 1951 Salzburg, Austria alien abduction, which we covered on this channel, involved a soldier who was abducted by aliens. In that case, the soldier reported to be paralyzed by a pencil-like device and then taken aboard their ship. It's important to note the being was described differently in that case, having grayish-white skin with bug eyes. That said, it seems that there is a possible connection between these two cases. The man was paralyzed standing up and also was floated up to the ship. The man in that case also ran into the being on a dark path, leading some to believe that he stumbled upon something he shouldn't have. Paralysis is something reported quite often from people who have had close encounters with extraterrestrials. Many alien abductee cases follow the same pattern. An individual wakes up in the middle of the night paralyzed and sees several gray aliens. He or she then floats out through a window or up through the roof. Whatever these entities are, they seem to possess the ability to allow people to move through solid surfaces. The person then winds up on a metal table and medical experiments, sometimes horrific ones, are performed. Next thing they know, they end up back in their beds. Many believe the number taken is much higher than reported. This is because people believe the experience was just a bad dream, or simply they need to move on with their lives. It's even speculated by some that UFO disclosure hasn't happened because of the abductions. How could the government possibly respond to these reports, especially when they seem completely unable to prevent them? Others theorize that the government cut a deal to allow the abductions in exchange for technology. Coming back to the case, while Maurice might not have been abducted, it could have occurred. There are cases where beings seem to be able to manipulate time. A case we recently covered from France, the Pierre Manet encounter, involved this. Still, perhaps the beings were just collecting samples and paralyzed Maurice to protect themselves. By all accounts, Maurice had no further encounters with the beings, and his temporary health problems would subside. Maurice, in time, was finally able to start staying awake for long periods and got back to tending to his lavender farm